Please welcome Colorado Christian University President Dr. Donald Sweeting and Chairman of the Western Conservative Summit, Jeff Hunt, and Will and Christy Armstrong, son and daughter-in-law of the late Bill Armstrong.
Hey, well, good evening, folks. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful occasion. Hey, before I get started on my official remarks, is it just me? Or how many people have been to the Western Conservative Summit before? It's a little hard to see, but there's a lot of people that have been here. Is it just me? Or does it seem like the summit keeps getting better and better and better? Yes? It sure has been for me this year. I am joined by my wife Christy tonight to make a special presentation. You know, there are few men in this world who are recognized, congratulated, esteemed for their work and life by a sitting United States president, let alone President Ronald Reagan. As a longtime advisor and close friend of President Reagan, our guest tonight served with the president during the rebirth of the American spirit, the end of the Cold War, and through the great economic boom, the catalyst of which we now call, of course, Reaganomics. Edwin Meese began his service to then Governor Reagan in 1967. He served in the presidential transition team in 1980 as President Reagan was taking office, and then ultimately joined the White House as counselor to the president. And in 1985, Mr. Meese became the 75th Attorney General for the United States of America. Well, so as I was putting my remarks together, I thought, gee, I wonder what President Reagan had to say about our esteemed guest tonight. So as the Attorney General, Mr. Meese, was leaving the State Department, President Reagan said this, quote, "Ed Meese has served the American people loyally and well. He has led the Department of Justice with courage and vigor, and his work on public policy has resulted in many outstanding accomplishments." President Reagan went on to say, whether it's fighting illegal drug trafficking or international terrorism or recruiting sound judges to the bench, you've set new standards of accomplishments. Indeed. General Meese, as most of you know, has continued his service to the country since the Reagan administration through his work at the Heritage Foundation and its Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and as a member of the board of the Mercatus Center. He remains a thought leader in the conservative movement as an author and lecturer on the important issues of our day. General Meese, you have indeed shown your dedication and service to our country, to the law, to our Constitution, through your lifetime of service. By taking tough stands with courage, intellect, and grace, you reflect the best of America. Thank you for your service, both in government and outside of it. And as an aside, I'm personally grateful to have known you and Mrs. Meese, who is here and joined us from my days of friendship with your daughter Dana in high school, to political events over the last 25 years or so, all leading to this evening. And I gotta tell you, my dad would really be pleased by this evening's event and honoring you. As a great journalist once wrote, "Leaders are the custodians of a nation's ideals, of its permanent hopes, the dreams it cherishes, of the faith that makes a nation out of mere individuals." We recognize you tonight, General Meese, in that spirit. So first, as a token of our admiration for you, General Meese, and gratitude for your service to country and for your friendship with my dad, I'm pleased to present to Colorado Christian University President Don Sweeting a contribution from the Armstrong family towards the continued legacy of my father's work at CCU in your name, General Meese, to your honor and your lifetime of achievements. Well, and now, General Meese, we gather to honor you this evening because we still believe America is one nation, indivisible and under God. Yes? Yeah. We're here to renew our commitment to the things that made America great in the first place. And at this moment, I'd like to quote somebody. We're here to saddle up and ride to the sound of gunfire. We're here to fortify freedom. That despite our troubles, despite our problems, this is still the greatest and most blessed and most opportune country in the world. Yes? There is nothing like it. There's never been anything like it. And by the grace of God, it's going to be even greater next year and the year after and the year after that and for all generations to come. We are a nation truly blessed by God. So on behalf of me and Christy and my entire family, my mother Ellen, who couldn't be here tonight, and my sister who's also traveling, on behalf of Colorado Christian University, it brings me great pleasure to present you, Mr. Meese, with the 2018 William L. Armstrong Award for demonstrating a lifetime of commitment to the values my dad treasured: the sanctity of life, religious freedom, the original intent of the Constitution. These have indeed made our nation, America, the greatest country in the world. Mr. Meese, congratulations. Please welcome Mr. Meese.
Please welcome former Attorney General of the United States, the Honorable Edwin Meese.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Thank you very much. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Dr. Sweetley, and all of you here tonight for that very warm welcome, and particularly for this marvelous trophy here. I couldn't think of a better way to depict anything that is for anyone who has had the privilege of working for Ronald Reagan than to see somebody on horseback. Because believe me, that was one of his favorite occupations, was riding horseback. Some of you may have been to his ranch, but that was a big thing in his life. And so to have that particular figure there, and certainly to have the presentation from Colorado Christian University and from the Armstrong family, is of great importance to me and something that I will cherish the rest of my life. It's really great to be able to be here tonight and to participate in this gathering and in the work that you have been doing over the past couple of days, particularly your efforts, as you say, fortifying freedom as the work of this Western Conservative Summit. And so it is just it's kind of the top notch for me to receive this award and have this opportunity to talk with you, particularly the fact that that the award is named in honor of my good friend Bill Armstrong. And of course it was a special honor to have Will to present it on behalf of the university and this gathering. You know, I had the privilege of working with Bill Armstrong, and I really was able to see that video backstage before we came up here, and to see how well it depicted a truly great American and a man who has given so much for his country as well as for his community and certainly for the service of God. I want to thank Bill for all he did as portrayed in that video, and again thank the university and the Armstrong family for this award. I want to also express my appreciation to God for all the benefits and all the opportunities that I've been given. And I want to particularly thank my wife, Ursula, who is here, without whom I couldn't have accomplished any of these things. As you heard earlier, I had the privilege of working with Bill during the Ronald Reagan presidency. We were also campmates together at a men's business camp in California where we would spend a couple of weeks every summer. And I've certainly been a great admirer of all he has done, first as a senator, as a university president, as the founder of this conference, and quite frankly, as a great all-around patriot. You know, you saw a little of it in the video, but the praise that he received at the time of his passing certainly verifies and confirms his place in the history of this country as a great public official and a great Christian statesman. He was described in so many ways, some of you saw in the video, but there was no question that he, as a pillar of Colorado's Republican Party and as an outstanding senator, was a real force behind the conservative economic policy that helped Ronald Reagan do so much to start a new era of economic growth in the United States. Bill was a champion of limited government and has been mentioned a devout Christian, and actually the impressive thing in the tributes paid to him was the fact that he was hailed by members of both parties for his long service to Colorado and to the country. In the words of one Republican leader, Bill Armstrong's election in 1978, along with a few other new Republican senators that year, paved the way for the Reagan presidency and particularly a new Senate Republican majority in 1980. And it also ushered in the long-term, the ability and a new generation of Republican leadership that has lasted for almost 30 years. Bill Armstrong's legacy was summed up in these words. His booming voice, and you heard some of that at the end, right up to the end there in his speaking to the audience at the university, his piercing gaze and his love of fellow patriots will never be forgotten. So many people in Colorado were brought to conservative ideas and to optimism through Senator Bill Armstrong. The United States is a better place because of his grace, humility, and boundless spirit. How can anybody then not truly rejoice in receiving an award that is given in his name? Well, actually, it was the connection between Bill Armstrong and the presidency of Ronald Reagan that suggested my topic for these remarks. Is Ronald Reagan still relevant to our government and political scene today? Now, I raise the question because some politicians and pundits would try to consign Ronald Reagan to the dusty pages of history. You may have seen some of the headlines and articles in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other liberal news media. And as I was thinking of this when I heard the speaker that preceded me earlier this evening, and he was talking about things that just ain't so, but they have published articles such as one that is entitled, "Could Ronald Reagan be nominated by the Republican Party today?" Or "The De-Reaganization of the Republican Party," or "Ronald Reagan is no longer relevant to America and its 21st century challenges." Well, even in the last primary election, in that campaign for the nomination for president, one Republican candidate actually said that the country and the GOP had to move beyond the nostalgia for Reagan's heyday. And likewise, a Republican consultant recently wrote, "Ronald Reagan is dead, accept it, the Reagan fixation is a drag on the future." Well, I would suggest to you that if it comes to predictions like this, there are many people, most of them on the other side of the line, and a few on our side, unfortunately, that are just absolutely wrong. Despite these gloomy pronouncements, I would suggest to you today that the record indicates a much different view of the Reagan legacy. This is not just nostalgia, but is really a fair assessment of Ronald Reagan's place in history, as well as his place in the hearts of the people of the United States. This past week marked the 14th anniversary of President Reagan's death, which took place on the 5th of June, 2004. And as one writer described what happened on that day, he said, "In the days that followed President Reagan's death, America witnessed sights unseen since the death of John F. Kennedy. And that was people keeping all-night vigils to touch his casket and say goodbye. lining highways by the thousands to express their gratitude, their affection, and their love. Those born after Reagan's presidency might wonder, what was it about this man that evoked then, and still does today, such deep, heartfelt admiration? Well, I would suggest to you that history tells us the answer. From 1981 through 1989, Ronald Reagan led a great American comeback. You heard a little bit about that this evening. He not only achieved what his critics said would be impossible, but he made it seem easy. His leadership transformed a sputtering U.S. economy into a rocket of growth that led to a generation of prosperity. He restored a neglected U.S. military and its alliances. He engineered the eventual defeat of the Soviet Empire, and he did it without starting a war and without firing a shot. And through it all, he revived the spirit of America, he restored our hopes, and he strengthened our faith. Now, this is one writer describing what he saw over this period of time. And he went on to say, despite his astonishing success, some dismiss Ronald Reagan as no longer relevant to America and its 21st century challenges. We should beg to differ. While issues and conditions change, people's motivations and goals do not. They still revolve around home and family and hopes and dreams for the future. Moreover, Reagan grasped more than just what was timeless. He had a great capability for adapting to changing realities. He understood growth. He had a sharp eye for danger and recognized the leader's duty to prepare and protect the nation. And his profound respect for the dignity, rights, and responsibilities of the individual, rooted in constitutional principles and 5,000 years of Judeo-Christian history and tradition, would equip a leader well to deal wisely with the contentious issues that preoccupy our country today. I don't think there's any time, no matter how difficult they get, that people can't look back on the time that Ronald Reagan was president and say that man taught us a lot about how to handle crises, also how to handle success, and how to make this a better nation. And that's why we might conclude, as the writer that I mentioned earlier had said, Ronald Reagan not only remains relevant today, his star will still be shining brightly 100 years from today. He was courageous and brave. He championed timeless principles. He united, inspired, emboldened, and protected his countrymen. And during his 8 years in office, he moved history. He left America stronger, freer, and better. That's the legacy of Ronald Reagan that we enjoy today. But I believe that for us today, at this particular conference, particularly not just Ronald Reagan's place in history that is important, but rather the lessons that he provided that are critical today and will remain invaluable in the future. And these lessons stem from his qualities of leadership. He had a vision of where our country should go and what it could be. He had the ability to communicate that vision and persuade others not only to share the vision, but also to work for it. He gave us a personal example of courage and integrity and perseverance. He had a commitment that came from his youth throughout his life to constitutional government and the fair and honest interpretation of our Constitution. And he had a lifelong devotion to the rule of law. You know, I'm often asked by people who heard that I worked with Ronald Reagan, what was Ronald Reagan really like? I would suggest there's one thing that all of the historians, all of the political pundits have probably not put enough emphasis on. And that was the most important aspect, I believe, of his personality, beside the tremendous qualities that I just mentioned. But it was his optimism and his cheerfulness, which he gave away and which was received and accepted and encouraging to other people. And these characteristics were particularly demonstrated by his sense of humor. I'm sure most of you who were alive when Ronald Reagan was president could see on television or in his speeches or in his press conferences this sense of humor that he had, the jokes and stories that enlivened his speeches, and the spontaneous quips that often took place at the news conferences. I've often been asked when I say this, somebody says, well, what was your favorite Reagan story? Well, there were a lot of them, but the one that he told more times than any other, some of you might have heard about it, was about the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and an Irishman. Now, it sounds like a kind of a strange topic for a political figure or a leader of the country, but as he told it, it was an Irish story. He said the only ethnic stories you can tell is about your own ethnic group, and as he would say, I'm an Irishman, so I get to tell it. Well, as he told this story, it took place in the days, some of you may remember that there was a big war, more or less, between the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and the government of Great Britain. And during that time, the number of the IRA representatives would come to the United States, try to find their former Irishmen who had moved to this country, and use that to raise money. Well, the CIA heard about this, and they figured they better find out what was going on. And so they decided to send one of their agents to Ireland, put him in what they call deep cover, and find out what was going on. And so they found a man by the name of Murphy. They thought that was a pretty good name to send to Ireland. And they brought him in and briefed him and said, Murphy, you're going into a deep cover assignment. This is something that has to be handled very carefully. You should not take a radio with you because those transmissions might give you away. You should not make any phone calls to the United States. You should have no contact with headquarters whatsoever. Your job is to melt into the landscape, see what you can find out, and when we need your information, we'll send a courier to debrief you. Well, obviously, those of you who saw the spy movies during World War II, and since that time, there's always a password so that when a courier comes or another agent comes, they know that the contact is with an authentic agent from headquarters. And so in this case, they decided the password would be something kind of simple that they could work into a conversation easily. And it was, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." They thought that was easy enough to not raise a lot of attention. And so off Murphy goes and goes to the area where he's supposed to be located. Well, a few weeks go by, and headquarters decided it's time to find out what he's learned. And so they dispatched a courier, inform him of the password, and send him off to Ireland. The courier doesn't know exactly where Murphy is going to be found, but he's supposed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of a little village. And so, looking for an Irishman, the courier goes to this village where he's supposed to be near and arrives and goes to the local pub. And he goes to the pub and orders a whiskey. He was a very, very accomplished spy, because had he ordered a martini, he would have given himself away. But he ordered a whiskey and started sipping his whiskey, and then he engaged the bartender in conversation. And they talked about the weather, they talked about the crops, they talked about various mundane subjects. And the courier says, by the way, I'm looking for a man named Murphy. Well, the bartender kind of leans back and says, we got a lot of Murphys around here. There's Murphy the bootmaker. He has a shop across the road. We have Murphy the farmer. He has a place 2 miles down this main road here. And by the way, my name is Murphy too. Well, the courier takes a sip of his whiskey and says, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." "Oh," says the bartender, "you want Murphy the spy. He lives around the corner." Well, I thought you would enjoy that only because it gives you a little glimpse into the way those of us had the privilege of working with Ronald Reagan were entertained in the Oval Office in some morning when all the news looked gloomy, and he wanted to lighten the load on our shoulders and get us laughing before we left the office. Well, looking at the various issues that face our country and the world today, it's apparent to me that the lessons that we can learn from Ronald Reagan are more than relevant. One, for example, involved his willingness to engage our nation's opponents, and particularly how to deal with them. I think of that particularly as President Trump is now on his way to one of those types of engagement that are so critical today. Ronald Reagan, of course, in 1981, found that the Soviet Union was at the peak of its power, its aggressive behavior, and its threats to peace. And so he bided his time, and he built up our military capability, built up our alliances, because he realized that you don't negotiate from a position from weakness, you negotiate only from a position of strength. And when our country was well on the way to becoming stronger and capable of carrying our load in maintaining the peace, he was ready. And so he sought a summit with the rulers of the Soviet Union. But as he said, they kept dying on me. First there was Brezhnev, then there was Andropov, then there was Chernenko. Finally, in 1985, Ronald Reagan got a live one. And so, with Gorbachev, a series of summits began. But Ronald Reagan didn't feel just having a summit was enough. He was willing to walk out rather than accept a bad deal. And when in Reykjavik, Gorbachev offered amazing concessions in terms of cutting the troops and the military capability of the Soviet Union in half, it was a tremendous lure to try to bring Ronald Reagan to that kind of an agreement. And Ronald Reagan knew that if he did that, it would be the end of his efforts to prevent nuclear war, because he would have had to give up the Strategic Defense Initiative, which I'll mention in a few moments. And so rather than risk that kind of a bad deal, he walked out. Now, there was great criticism from some of the news media, great criticism from his political opponents and so on, but he knew what he was doing, and he knew that the only way to engage our opponents is to do what is ultimately right for the country and for our strength and security, and not to worry about the political consequences that might accrue to him. And so he didn't give up. He persevered with ultimately having additional summits with Gorbachev, and finally in 1987 obtained an agreement which eliminated a whole class of nuclear weapons in Europe, set up a relationship that relieved international tensions and reduced the possibility of war. And certainly, because of his courage in standing up and not doing the easy thing, but taking the hard but necessary road, did a tremendous job to ultimately result in the end of the Cold War. It was happy to see that President Trump, as he was leaving for the trip to North Korea, mentioned that he indicated that he apparently has the same idea, and that's one of the lessons that certainly was sticking in his mind. In the reading, in reading the history of national security, today the ballistic missile threat and the potential for nuclear weapons being used against the United States or its allies is very real, as we all understand. Ronald Reagan believed that a nuclear war could never be won and should never be fought. And he didn't just feel that diplomacy itself was enough to protect the nation against that eventuality. And that's why he began, in the earliest days of his presidency, to seek to find an antidote to nuclear weapons. And that was why in 1983 he announced the development of a plan to find a defense against ballistic missile against ballistic missile warfare in the Strategic Defense Initiative. His lesson was that he gives us is that it was important that we now continue what he started. Unfortunately, after his presidency, other presidents allowed a decreased intensity of the research and development for the SDI, and as a result, it has taken a longer time. But prototypes and means of deploying the SDI, now called the Ballistic Missile Defense Program, certainly have been successful, and have given us a path which ultimately, I believe, will provide the shield against nuclear weapons that Ronald Reagan talked about. And that's why the lesson for us today, and for those coming along in the political realm, is that we must accelerate the research and development to make nuclear weapons obsolete and to carry out Ronald Reagan's best advice and best lesson for this nation. In terms of the Constitution, Ronald Reagan was, as I mentioned, a strong constitutionalist. He believed that we ought to follow the Constitution in all of its detail and according to its original understanding. And that's why he started the business of not only talking about this, but also appointing judges who were faithful to the Constitution and who would interpret it in the way that the founders had in mind when it was written. And of course, this too is something where President Trump is to be commended for the outstanding judges that he has appointed. And has furthered that lesson from Ronald Reagan. I could go on to other things. Economic growth, for example. You notice that the two major points for economic growth that President Trump has enacted during his 18 months in office have been tax reduction across the board and regulatory reform. Two of the principal planks in Ronald Reagan's program in 1981 to deal with the economic crisis at that time. And finally, promoting the rule of law. You know, in August of 1981, Ronald Reagan hadn't been in office very long, but the professional air controllers struck. Now, strikes by them was illegal and a violation of the oath they had taken. And there was only one thing to do to uphold the law, and that was either to get them back to work or to, as Ronald Reagan said, if they did not come back, they had forfeited their job. Many people said he would never go through with it. The press criticized him for even thinking about doing anything. They said other presidents have let these things slide, and eventually you come to some sort of a settlement. But Ronald Reagan said, no, if we have wholesale defiance and disobedience to the law, then I'm not carrying out my constitutional responsibility to see that the laws are properly carried out. And so as a result, and the interesting thing is, he hated to fire anybody. It bothered him because it reminded him of some of the tragedies that his own father had to face during his young life. But what he did was, he said, I will give you, to the illegal strikers, I will give you 48 hours to return to work. And if you return to work, there will be no penalty. But if you do not return to work by that time, then you will have forfeited your job. Well, what happened, that was when the press said that airplanes would fall out of the sky, that air traffic would be disrupted for months, and so on. Well, the President, the Secretary of Transportation, and others cobbled together a force to go in and take the place of the striking workers. Some of them were people who did come back to work. Others were supervisors. They brought in military air controllers from around the country, and within 24 hours, the air traffic system started to work again, and within a couple of days, air traffic was back to normal, and the law had been enforced. The integrity of the country had been preserved, and the rule of law that had been established by Ronald Reagan was not only something that was important in this country, but we later learned after the Cold War was over that it totally impressed the Soviet Union rulers, that a man who had had the courage to do that was something they didn't want to take a chance with in terms of their own relationships. Well, there are many other lessons and examples of how Ronald Reagan left us a legacy from the past and a blueprint for success in the future. An initial assessment indicates that President Trump is indeed looking at them, and we hope will continue to follow. Our job as conservatives is to preserve and promote these lessons and to motivate our leaders and our citizens to support the principles, the policies, and the practices that Ronald Reagan demonstrated to our nation. Thus, we can continue Ronald Reagan's quest to ensure that the United States remains his beloved shining city, the shining city that he talked about on a hill, an example for the rest of the world, and a beacon of liberty to people throughout the world. Thank you.